As a drunk driving defense attorney, I can state that the best way to avoid an arrest for drunk driving is not to drink and drive at all, because there is almost a zero threshold amongst law enforcement as far as acceptance of any drinking and any driving. It is very close to a zero tolerance world that we now live in. That being said, if you're pulled over, you need to be within your personal limits in order to operate a motor vehicle safely. Each and every person knows what their limit is or should, and they should abide by what they feel is responsible. If stopped by a police officer, you're going to be asked certain questions, license and registration, which you should always hand over. You might be asked preliminary questions as to where you're coming from and where you're going, and you can certainly answer those. If you have been drinking and an officer wants to ask you specific questions about what you've drank, when you drank, you can refuse to answer those questions, and you should. If you're asked to step from a motor vehicle to conduct field sobriety tests, now I work in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, there are certain rules that go along with that request. In both states, you are not required by law to submit to any field sobriety testing, and I would advise you not to, because in my experience, those tests are designed to fail. If you are asked to submit to a chemical test, whether that be blood, breath, or urine, I would again advise you not to take such a test, because that test is imperfect at best. And you do not want your credibility to be riding on that particular machine, whatever machine it may be in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Remain cooperative, remain polite. The police have a very difficult job to do out there, and they try to do it well. Don't make it more difficult for them. We do not suggest that you submit to the field sobriety testing, because they are not a fair approximation of your ability to drive safely. And if you do not give the government that information, that evidence, the burden is entirely upon them to prove that you've committed a crime. And by not giving them that unfair evidence to use against you, you've protected yourself. If you refuse a breath test in New Hampshire, you will lose your license for a period of at least 180 days based on that refusal alone. If you refuse a breath test in Massachusetts, you will lose your license for a period of 180 days, at least based on that decision alone. If you blow over the legal limit, it's a 180 loss of license in New Hampshire. It is a 30-day loss of license in Massachusetts. If you refuse to participate in field sobriety testing, my experience is in both states, you will be arrested. However, you will not have furnished evidence for the government to use against you, and that's evidence that we, as a practice, do not consider fair. The fact that you have refused field sobriety testing or a breath test in Massachusetts is not admissible in a courtroom against you on the question of guilt. The fact that you refused a breath test or refused field sobriety testing in New Hampshire is admissible against you on the issue of guilt. So that's a decision that you do not make lightly, but we would advise that you do not take those tests.